just ordered Russian troops into separatist areas of Ukraine in a major escalation of tensions. The Russian president called it a peacekeeping mission after he officially recognized the two breakaway regions as independent.
All the responsibility for a possible continuation of bloodshed will be entirely on the conscience of the regime in Kiev.
Dan is in eastern Ukraine tonight, where residents are said to be understandably fearful. But even more alarming was Putin's attempt to entirely rewrite post-Cold War history. Ukraine had never really been an independent state, he said, a claim with enormous potential implications all across Europe. We'll have analysis from Dan near the border, Neil in Moscow, and Emma in Washington. Also on News at 10 tonight. Back to normal, as promised, Boris Johnson today announced all COVID restrictions were being lifted. It is a massive relief for many, but complicated for business. If you test positive but feel fine, should you come into work?
Would you still self-isolate if it wasn't compulsory?
I don't think I would.
And after Eunice, now Franklin wreaks havoc.
You can't really put it into words, you know, it's your livelihood, your business. What do you think, what do you do? It's just hard.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. Vladimir Putin has tonight, just a few minutes ago, dramatically raised the stakes in Russia's standoff with Ukraine, pushing the two countries ever closer to war. The Russian president recognized the independence of two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine and then ordered his military to begin what Moscow called a peacekeeping mission there. The areas in question, Luhansk and Donetsk, have been controlled by Russian-backed separatist forces since 2014, amid an ongoing conflict with Ukraine's military. In an ominous warning during a televised address, Mr. Putin told leaders in Kiev to end so-called hostilities, or they would be responsible for more bloodshed. With a diplomatic solution to the crisis seemingly fading tonight, we'll speak to Emma in Washington, Dan in eastern Ukraine, and Neil in Moscow as the West plans new sanctions and the world waits to see what will happen next.
He began the dismemberment of Ukraine 8 years ago with the seizure of Crimea. Tonight, with the stroke of a pen, he claimed two more Ukrainian republics, recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk. A clear and unambiguous breach of international law, the UN Charter, and Russia's own treaty obligations guaranteeing Ukraine's borders. Predictably, there were cameras on hand to see supporters of the Russian puppet regime in Donetsk celebrating the news. They, with Moscow's help, have defied Kiev for 8 years. Now they're likely to have the full might of Russia's military behind them. In an often rambling, hour-long speech, Putin had explained his decision to the Russian people, saying Ukraine was simply a mistake of history made by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, one that he was putting right.
In this regard, I deem it necessary to make a decision that should have been made a long time ago, to immediately recognise the independence and sovereignty of Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Those who seize the power and keep the power in Kiev, we demand to stop hostilities immediately. Otherwise, all the responsibility for the possible continuation of the bloodshed will be on the consciousness of the regime that is ruling in Kiev.
And those last words were a clear threat to Ukraine. This isn't over. War remains very much on his mind. In London and other European capitals, there was swift and unequivocal condemnation.
This is plainly in breach of international law. It's a violation, a flagrant violation of the sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine. I think it's a very ill omen and a very dark sign.
In Lugansk, one of the two breakaway republics, tonight, claims of a car bomb attack against government offices. There may well be more of this to come, and no one will be surprised if it's quickly followed by an invitation to the Russian army to come and protect them. And that is the problem for the Western response. This is clearly a breach, but it is not, at least yet, military action. And if the Russian troops do move in, do they go beyond the areas already controlled by separatists, thus provoking an all-out war? As always in this crisis, the ability to escalate and thus the strategic initiative remains with President Putin. James Mace, News at 10, Kiev.
Well, there were many disturbing aspects of Mr. Putin's speech tonight, not least in the attempt to rewrite, as I said at the start, post-Cold War history almost entirely. Ukraine had never really been an independent state, he said, which will certainly come as news to his citizens who fought hard for their democracy, but may also send a chill down the spines of citizens of all the other former Soviet satellites all across Europe, from Poland to Estonia. Well, in a moment, we'll get the latest from Emma in Washington and indeed Neil in Moscow. But Dan, maybe we can begin with you in eastern Ukraine. Can you just give us a situation report, if you like? We should note that apart from anything else, although the Russian separatists control these areas, the area they claim is much bigger than the one they actually control. What is the situation there tonight?
Well, within the last hour, President Putin has ordered in the so-called peacekeepers. There are videos circulating online. We haven't managed to verify them, but showing columns of military vehicles heading into the centre of Donetsk. That's no real surprise. We've spoken to people inside those separatist areas, and they're really worried. There are reports of forcible conscription going on, young men literally being grabbed off the streets and marched in to sign up. There are people who are very concerned that they will never again be a part of Ukraine, that this is over, really, in terms of them ever being able to cross across that line of contact. The real concern, though, is that you've got now Russian troops going into these areas formally, potentially with large amounts of weaponry, facing off in these 300-mile-long complex of trenches directly against Ukrainian troops. And the possibility for an escalation, whether it's unintended or deliberate, is now much, much greater. And of course, everyone is wondering as well whether this is the last roll of the dice by President Putin, if this was what he was after all along, or whether, in fact, this is just the beginning of several steps, the last one, of course, possibly being the full invasion of the rest of Ukraine.
OK, Dan, thank you very much indeed. Well, maybe we can put that now to Neil. Look, a lot of people who listened to all of that speech tonight will have found it quite chilling, Neil. I mean, he really made claims that, if you extrapolate, could have implications for all the old former Soviet satellites, but certainly for Ukraine, which he implied was not at any point an independent state, which will certainly be news to its citizens. So what is the view from Moscow tonight, and where do you think Putin goes from here?
Tom, I think the gravity of what has happened tonight should not be underestimated. This was a day that started with hopes of a possible summit between President Putin and President Biden to try and solve all of this. And yet here we are at the end of it, with the diplomatic route now more remote than ever. Until now, Russia has never officially recognised these two self-declared republics. And I think when people heard this news tonight in Ukraine and in the West, they may have thought, well, is Russia going to use this as an excuse to move its forces openly into these areas? And as we've learned in the last half hour, President Putin has announced that he is sending troops, which he calls peacekeeping forces, into these areas. This decision tonight also effectively kills the Minsk agreement, the internationally recognised process over the last 7 or 8 years designed to try and solve the crisis in that part of Ukraine. It was only partly implemented, and that was part of the issue as well. But what struck me tonight, Tom, as well, was that it felt like this address had been at least 22 years in the making, from the time when President Putin came into power. Here was a former KGB man attacking the threats he says Russia has faced from NATO's expansion near its borders. This is a major escalation tonight with the deployment of these Russian troops, and these are now critical and crucial hours for Ukraine, for Russia and the West.
OK, Neil, thank you very much indeed. Well, Emma, maybe I can put all that to you. Dan, in a way, asking one question, saying, look, is this Putin's first move or is it his last move? Was this his aim, or is this just the opening gambit? And Neil pointing out that this is a huge Rubicon being crossed here. So I guess the big question is, how does the US and President Biden respond?
well, this is their moment, this is the test, whether or not this alliance that they say that they've been building, that is strong, will actually withstand the pressure that it's now going to face. They have immediately said that there will be sanctions issued. That has been something that the US has said, the EU and the UK says will follow tomorrow. They are not the full gamut of sanctions, though. These are a limited number of sanctions. They are trying to hold back in the hope that that might deter any further action by the Russians, because if there was further action and a perception that there had been a further invasion, that is where the full gamut of sanctions would be brought into play. President Biden has been on the phone throughout the afternoon. He's spoken to the French and Germans. He's also spoken to the Ukrainians, trying to insist to them that they have his full support. But what that full support is really going to need to be demonstrated over the coming hours. President Putin says that his actions are acts of peace. He is sending in peacekeepers. It will be the determination of President Biden whether or not they are seen as acts of peace or acts of war.
OK, Emma, for now, thank you very much indeed. Well, it is a widely held belief that despite all the Kremlin's denials, Russia will soon launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine for all the world to see. But there is another scenario being considered by intelligence agencies within Ukraine who believe the West has misjudged President Putin. They believe that the main attack could instead take place in the shadows, harder to spot, but perhaps no less devastating.
Life goes on in Kiev. One theory in Ukraine's intelligence community is that even now a full invasion of the entire country is considered by Russia to be too expensive. That military movements are aimed at adding pressure to force a coup to bring down the government without troops reaching the capital.
They would have so-called far-right coup in Kiev. Again, this is what they always wanted to have. And they would have complete disorganization of Ukrainian national defense and security system. All of these components, they are based on strategic deception and misunderstanding of this strategy by the West.
Fake news and false flags are part of the Russian approach. Western governments say this is an example. This video, which Russia says shows Ukrainian soldiers sneaking across the border. Ukraine says they staged it. Studying the landscape and those two white pillars, ITV News matched it to this spot on satellite images. It is in Russia but the so-called saboteurs would have had to cross 25 miles of rebel-held territory to get there. It's a lazy afternoon on the riverbank in Kiev, but people are preparing for war. Parents and kids, firearms and explosives. The tutors are political activists, members of an ultra-nationalist group called Right Sector. Russia says this is a neo-Nazi organization. And even as we were filming on the beach, reports from Moscow came in saying its members were heading for the front line. They've become an important focus of the Kremlin's information war. The Russian media talks about your organization a lot.
Oh, he talk with terrorism, with monster.
They say you're neo-Nazis.
Look around. You see some neo-Nazist symbols. You see the Sigan. We just patriot of our country.
And now a new warning from the Ukrainian government about an imminent cyber attack. Ukraine's former head of cybersecurity says it will be a precursor to military action, and his country isn't prepared.
Worst scenario could be no information, shutting down all web resources, including government, transportation, energy sector, power grid.
And is the Ukrainian government prepared for something like that?
Absolutely no.
It is another aspect of Russia's approach to hybrid war. The feeling here is that the West doesn't get it. We may soon find out. Rohit Khatri, News at 10, Kiev.
And this is clearly a fast-moving situation tonight, so we will go back to speak to Rohit in Kiev for the latest at the end of the programme. Back here now, and it is easy to forget how much our lives changed in early 2020, the moment when COVID brought about restraints on our liberties, the likes of which we had never seen, or at least not in our lifetimes. For England, that chapter is ending. From the Prime Minister, who once told people to stay at home, today came the pronouncement that they can now choose how to live their lives. The legal requirement to self-isolate after a positive test will lift this week. From April, free testing will also end. It is doubtless a bold call from a government going where few have. For some, it can't come soon enough. For others, it's a moment of great trepidation.
2 years ago, we imported a virus from China that changed everything.
I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Prime Minister's orders didn't stop a tragic surge of deaths and serious illness, but lockdown and other restrictions brought our towns, cities, our lives to a juddering halt. Not anymore. Although the Omicron strain continues to disrupt us, the Prime Minister announced that within days it'll be our choice how we behave if we're infected.
This virus has not gone away. But because of the efforts we've made as a country over the past 2 years, we can now deal with it in a very different way, moving from government restrictions to personal responsibility.
The Prime Minister published a plan for the country to live with COVID, which included, from Thursday, an end to the law that forces us to isolate when we have the virus, no more tracing of our contacts, and no more special payments to poorer people when they're forced to isolate. From the 1st of April, we won't even be guided to isolate, and free tests will end for almost everyone. And in the spring, there'll be a 4th jab for the over 75s and the clinically vulnerable. Keir Starmer had big reservations.
The Prime Minister is also removing self-isolation support payments that allow many people to isolate and weakening sick pay. These are decisions which will hit the lowest paid and the most insecure workers the hardest, including care workers who got us through the toughest parts of the pandemic.
But the Prime Minister's decision to rely on antiviral drugs to fight the next wave, rather than telling us to stay home, even pleased Tory MPs who recently urged him to quit.
Cheer up the Prime Minister by welcoming what he has to say today. and say to him that the comment of the Leader of the Opposition that the government had no plan to deal with this was destroyed by his own friend, Right Honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central. After April the 1st, if you get COVID, will you isolate?
We're effectively dealing with a, particularly in vaccinated people, with a disease that is like norovirus or flu. As for me, I will exercise restraint and responsibility and try to avoid infecting other people.
However, the Prime Minister's scientific advisers weren't ready to say that COVID is just another nasty bug.
There is no guarantee that the next variant is as reduced severity as Omicron. It could be the same, it could be more, it could be less.
And no wonder that Jacqueline Fuller, deaf, with a heart transplant and whose immune system is compromised, is even more anxious about leaving the house after all the COVID restrictions have gone.
I know there'll be people out there that will think, oh, you know, this is great, it's the restrictions have been lifted, we can do what we want, we can go where I want. We can't. And I think it's just wrong, very wrong.
The point is anyone can get COVID, even, as we know, the Queen. Her Majesty's well enough to continue light duties, but imagine if she hadn't been vaccinated or she'd caught a more serious strain. Robert Peston, News at 10.
So people in England now have their own choices to make about how to live their lives. It's how some would have wanted it all along, more so since the vaccines arrived. It does, though, throw up numerous dilemmas. For example, should businesses tell staff who test positive to stay away? And will people who get COVID still stay home?
At this carpet shop in Birmingham, there's something they've long been hoping to cut. Self-isolation rules have cost them months of absences. The owner can't wait for the law to change.
So October, November, December was tough. You know, a lot of people got ill. A couple of the staff got ill a couple of times. it then puts strain on everyone else. I mean, for instance, I haven't had a week off for so long now, so hoping that with the restrictions out of the place, it's at least giving us the ability to, do some business as usual.
Until now, 6 staff have had to use their holidays. From Thursday, they won't get the £500 payment either.
The last year I had COVID twice, which meant I had to self-isolate for 20 days altogether.
20 days?
20 days, which literally took all of my holidays.
And would you still self-isolate if it wasn't compulsory?
I don't think I would, just because of finances and things. My partner's not at work at the minute, so I'd be losing too much money.
Vaccination centres will still be free, hopefully not of people. This one in Sandwell was quiet today, but the plan is to keep them busy as the main defence against COVID.
It's been going on too long. I suppose we've just got to live a normal life.
Do you think it's too soon to get rid of the restrictions?
I think it's too soon, saying that, yeah.
You're still worried about it?
Yeah.
Despite lower uptake in parts of the Midlands, like here in Sandwell, across the UK, 91% of people have now had at least one jab. And the government's made the calculation that the benefits of living with COVID now outweigh the risks of dying with it. In Walsall, Deb Gascoigne spent 18 months trying to outmanoeuvre the virus. She has blood cancer and only left the house to walk the dog. Soon, anyone she meets probably won't even be tested.
I can protect myself and my family can protect me to a certain degree, but if I'm going to lead a normal life to any extent, then I'm sort of reliant on other people, and unfortunately I think I'll be at more risk then.
For some, lifting restrictions is about personal responsibility. For others tonight, it feels like personal risk. Paul Brand, News at 10 in the West Midlands.
And Emily is here to talk about this for about the 10,000th time. What a journey it's been, isn't it? 2 years, and you think back to those first kind of you must stay at home, and here we are. Certainly in terms of restrictions, it's all over. There was, as we saw there, not for everyone by the longest shot. Could you just be clear, like 2 months ago, we were sitting here talking about how Omicron could still kill lots of people and be this terrible threat. And here we are only 2 months later, effectively all restrictions gone. Why is that, and what do you think the next 6 months are going to look like?
Well, I mean, things have changed. We're in a really different place from where we were 2 months ago. Back then, we didn't know how severe Omicron was, and very few of us had been boosted. But the evidence is now overwhelming. We know that Omicron causes a milder disease. We know that people are 70% less likely to need to stay in hospital for a night compared with Delta. Those who do need hospital treatment, the vast majority don't actually need to have intensive care treatment, and they don't go on to die. We also know that the booster offers really good protection against this new variant. So I think those are all the reasons why things are changing now. The threat posed by this virus is much smaller than it was back in December, mainly because of our knowledge about Omicron, but also because we've built up this really big immunity in our country. As for the next few weeks, I think there's overwhelming agreement, I think, among scientists that there will be a surge because people won't necessarily be isolating. They won't know that they've got the virus. But the vulnerable will be protected because of this spring booster. So I think really the onus for the rest of us is to just be responsible, to stay at home if we are ill or we think we have coronavirus. And yes, the lack of testing does mean there is a risk that a new variant could crop up unnoticed. It might be more severe, but the government is absolutely convinced that it can ramp up all these protections really quickly to ensure that it doesn't cause any harm to the rest of us.
OK, Emily, thank you. Feels like a really big milestone, but thank you for now. Now, for more on the rule changes in England and the state of play right across the UK, do head to our website. That is at itv.com/news. Now, on another running story, the nation has barely had a chance to take stock of the havoc wreaked by Storm Eunice. Indeed, some are still living in darkness, waiting for days on end for power to be restored. And yet, last night and into this morning, as many of you will have noticed, came more misery for thousands of people as Storm Franklin swept in. The third storm to hit the UK in a week brought high winds and flooding, the devastating impact of which is all too familiar for some.
Crashing into the coast of Northern Ireland, leaving a trail of debris and destruction in its midst. The Storm Franklin battered the seaside town of Portstewart, leaving cars stranded and businesses submerged.
There's no sea defences down here really. They don't work when it gets like this here, so we'll get wetsuits on. We'll go in and see what the damage is.
Across the north of England today, people rallied together as the record number of storms tested their resilience. The flooding forcing the high street to close in the town of Tadcaster.
Oh my goodness, is this your business?
Where business owners looked on in despair.
Just devastation. There's no words. You can't really put it into words. You know, it's your livelihood, your business. What do you think? What do you do? It's just hard. It's just really hard.
This is the third time that Tadcaster's high street has been flooded in 10 years. But just because it's happened before doesn't make it any less demoralising or disruptive.
The disruption continued on the trains, where passengers tried to navigate their way around thousands of cancellations, while repairs to power lines damaged last week have also been delayed because of the ongoing high winds.
I've got a thermos there, I was going to take it to my neighbours.
Leaving people like Annabelle near Liphook in Hampshire without electricity for 2 days.
I can't cook, I can't see in the evening at 6 o'clock, it's pitch dark. And I'm in despair because once again, here it is, it's freezing cold in this house, it's a very cold house anyway, and there's no news.
Tonight there are still more than 200 flood warnings in place across England, including in the Shropshire village of Ironbridge, where a danger to life has been declared, with days of heavy rainfall pushing flood barriers and people towards their limits. Hannah Miller, News at 10.
Some very sad news now, and in his brief 31 years, there was so much Jamal Edwards did to change the face of music. Doubtless there was more to come from the innovative entrepreneur before his sudden death on Sunday.
Yo, what's going on, people? It's Jamal Edwards, entrepreneur and founder of online music platform SBTV.
As a teenager, he set up the online music platform SBTV, providing a launchpad for artists who are now household names. Away from music, he was made an ambassador for the Prince's Trust, with the Prince of Wales praising his work to inspire the next generation. Ed Sheeran, Stormzy and Jessie J were just some of the up-and-coming stars who appeared on his channel, and tonight singer Anne-Marie joined those paying tribute to him.
I just want to make everyone realise how amazing he was and how incredible he was for the music industry. I think everyone's been saying the same thing. No one's got a bad word to say about him. Everyone is showing him so much love. It's just a shame he's gone so early, to be honest.
Now, while today brought a major milestone for COVID restrictions in England, changes in Australia perhaps meant even more to people.
724 apart, and he's my only son and I'm alone, so this means the world to me.
The country, at last, some might say, reopened its international borders after almost 2 years, sparking emotional scenes as friends and family were reunited for the first time since Australia imposed some of the world's toughest travel restrictions. OK, finally, tonight, as we've discussed, this has been a fast-moving story in Ukraine. So let's go back to Rohit, who is in Kiev, to try and talk about, at least hopefully going back to Rohit to see whether he's there. Is he there, Rohit? Yes, you are there. Well, that's good news. I can see you. Look, this has really been moving in the last hour. What are you hearing and where do you think it goes overnight?
Well, Tom, despite those late-night phone calls between Emmanuel Macron and Vladimir Putin, this phase of diplomacy is over, despite all those visits from ministers, despite the claims 7 days ago by Putin that he was withdrawing his troops from the border. This was an extraordinary speech, but Donbass and those separatist regions were only part of it. They were only a postscript. This was much broader. It was existential. It was about whether Ukraine is merely an accident of history. And so, of course, the question now becomes, yes, you know, this has started, but where does it end? Will Russian military come here to Kiev? We just don't know.
OK, it started, but where does it end? That is indeed the final quote of the night. See you tomorrow for more. Good night. Thanks for watching.